His hands trembled as the grocery bag slipped from his grip, not from weight, but from the sting of humiliation. A teenage boy sneered at him, demanding what he had worked hard to pay for. When he refused, whispers turned to accusations, and suddenly every eye burned into his skin. The mother's voice cut sharp, dripping with contempt as if his dignity were hers to dismiss. In moments, flashing lights painted him as the villain. Yet none knew who he really was. What happens when power hides in plain sight, waiting for the perfect moment to be revealed? Before diving into this gripping tale, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch more inspiring stories like this one. The evening air hung heavy over Willow Creek, a suburban neighborhood that prided itself on manicured lawns and pristine driveways. On the surface, it looked like the kind of place where nothing ugly could possibly bloom, where every hedge was trimmed the same height, where porch lights glowed in warm amber, and where neighbors waved politely while keeping their secrets behind shut doors. Yet, beneath the calm, something restless stirred, like a storm gathering beneath clear skies. James Carter pushed his cart slowly down the narrow sidewalk, its squeaky wheel rattling against the uneven pavement. His arms were strong, though the grocery bags stacked inside were modest, filled with essentials rather than luxuries: bread, milk, fresh fruit, a few canned goods. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had long learned that strength was best shown not through muscle, but through restraint. His stride was steady, his eyes sharp, though they carried the weight of someone who had grown used to measuring how much space he was allowed to take up in a world that often wished him invisible. The cool air brushed against his skin, carrying with it the faint smell of jasmine from a neighbor's garden. For James, moments like these, simple, solitary, were grounding. The uniform he wore during the day demanded discipline, demanded command, demanded a man unshaken. Out here, alone with his thoughts, he could let the armor slip, if only slightly. He was not just the commander then. He was a man, a father, a human being trying to balance burdens unseen by others. But even as he walked, a tension hummed beneath the silence. His phone vibrated in his pocket, and for a moment he considered ignoring it. He already knew what it would be. Another reminder of tomorrow's meeting, another case that required a steady hand, another call pulling him away from the life of simple errands and groceries. James paused under a street lamp and pulled the phone free, the pale blue glow lighting up the sharp lines of his face. He stared at the message, sighed, and tucked the device back into his coat. Responsibility rarely rested, even when he needed it to. From a distance, he looked like any other neighbor returning from the store, yet James's life was anything but ordinary. Beneath the surface of routine hid a history of battles fought, not with weapons, but with prejudice, expectation, and the ever-present judgment of those who saw only the color of his skin before the content of his character. Tonight, he had not come to the store as a commander, nor as a man of rank. He had come simply as James. And still, the world rarely allowed him that simplicity. The street was quiet except for the faint rustle of leaves. Porch lights flickered on one by one, children's laughter echoing faintly from behind closed windows. It should have been peaceful, but James felt the subtle shift of eyes watching him. It was not uncommon. In places like Willow Creek, familiarity was a shield, and outsiders, even neighbors, were measured against invisible scales. James was no stranger to the weight of those stares, to the way suspicion could bloom from something as innocent as a man walking home with groceries. He tightened his grip on the cart's handle and pressed forward. His mind wandered briefly to his daughter, Olivia, away at college, and how much lighter his steps always felt when he spoke to her. She was his anchor, his reminder of why he endured the long hours and the unspoken challenges. She had inherited his resilience, but carried it with a brightness he sometimes feared he had lost. James smiled faintly at the thought of her last message, an excited text about passing a difficult exam, complete with too many exclamation points. For her, he carried the weight without complaint, but weight has a way of pressing back. Just ahead, near the corner where the sidewalk curved past a cluster of townhouses, a boy no older than 12 lingered under a flickering porch light. His sneakers were scuffed, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a hoodie 2 sizes too large. The boy's gaze fixed on James's cart, his expression unreadable, balancing somewhere between curiosity and hunger. James slowed his pace, instinctively softening his posture, the same way he did when approaching someone vulnerable on the job. He had learned long ago that first impressions were fragile things, easily broken. Evening, James said, his voice calm, measured. He didn't expect an answer, but the boy stepped forward anyway, his eyes narrowing on the bags of food. "Those yours?" The boy asked, his tone sharp, though beneath it James caught the raw edge of something else, desperation, maybe even need. Children rarely mask hunger well. James tilted his head slightly. "Yes, just a few things for the week." He offered a small smile, patient but firm, a man well aware of boundaries. "Why?" The boy hesitated, then shrugged. "My mom says people like you shouldn't be around here." The words were rehearsed, borrowed from someone else, and they carried the sting of something too heavy for a child's shoulders. Yet even as he spoke to them, the boy's eyes flicked back to the cart. The conflict was written there, plain as day, prejudice planted by a parent clashing against the simple truth of an empty stomach. James's chest tightened, though he didn't let it show. He had heard versions of this before, too many times, but hearing it from a child still cut deep. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and brittle. James could feel the fragile lines of the boy's world pressing against him, lines drawn by someone else's fear. "Groceries don't care who eats them," James said softly. His voice was gentle, almost like a confession, but words, they can carry weight. You don't even realize. He let the words hang, not as a lecture, but as something the boy could choose to hold on to or let slip away. Before the boy could answer, a sharp voice cut through the air from behind the porch door. "Ethan, get away from him right now." The command cracked like a whip, pulling the boy back a step. The screen door swung open, and a woman in her early 40s stormed out, her expression tight with indignation. She wore her authority like armor, chin high, eyes narrowed, voice sharpened by certainty. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her gaze locking onto James with cold precision. In that moment, the quiet of the street fractured. Neighbors' curtains shifted, unseen eyes drawn to the scene. The tension that had been humming beneath the surface of Willow Creek surged forward, no longer hidden. James stood still, his cart at his side, his face unreadable but his eyes steady. He had lived long enough to know this moment was not about groceries. It was about something far larger, something that had always lingered at the edges of places like this. The woman stepped down onto the porch, pulling her son closer to her side. "I don't know who you think you are, but you don't belong here," she snapped. "I'm calling the HOA, and the police if I have to." Her words hung in the cool night air, sharp as broken glass. The boy lowered his gaze, ashamed, caught between the pull of his mother's authority and the quiet steadiness of the man before him. And James, still calm, unshaken, felt the storm he had sensed brewing finally break open. The woman's words carried through the night like a siren, loud enough to rattle the fragile calm of Willow Creek. James stood motionless for a moment, his hand resting on the cart as if the groceries themselves were the only tether keeping him grounded. He had faced weapons, chaos, and the sharp bite of violence in places far more dangerous than this quiet street, but there was something about the venom in her tone, delivered with the certainty of someone who believed the ground beneath her belonged to her alone, that struck deeper than any bullet ever could. Her son, Ethan, shuffled at her side, his shoulders drawn tight with shame. James could see the boy's conflict written in the way he stared at the pavement instead of at either of them. A child repeating what he had been taught, now silenced by the woman who had planted the words in him. It was almost too familiar, innocence crushed beneath the weight of someone else's bitterness. "Ma'am," James said evenly, his voice low but steady, "there's no need for threats. I was only coming home with my groceries." The woman let out a harsh laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Home? Don't lie to me. People like you don't live here. You think I don't know? You come in here walking around like you belong? No, not in Willow Creek." Not around my family. It was not the first time James had been told he didn't belong, but there was something in her eyes, icy calculating, that unsettled him. This wasn't just about suspicion. This was about power, about control, about drawing lines and forcing others to stay behind them. She stepped closer, her phone now in her hand. The blue screen cast a ghostly glow across her face. "I'll call the police right now," she hissed. "And don't think for a second they'll be on your side." James almost smiled at that, a bitter curve tugging at the corner of his mouth. If only she knew. But he didn't answer, not yet. Some truths were more powerful when held in silence until the right moment. From the corner of his eye, James noticed a flicker of movement, curtains shifting in nearby houses, shadows forming behind glass. Neighbors were watching. It was as if the entire street held its breath, waiting to see what would happen, waiting to confirm the stories they already whispered behind closed doors. James could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down like a storm cloud ready to break. "Mom, don't." Ethan's voice trembled, but the woman's sharp glance silenced him instantly. Her grip tightened on his shoulder, pulling him back toward the porch. "Go inside," she ordered. "Now." The boy obeyed, though reluctantly, casting one last glance at James before slipping through the doorway. His eyes held something unspoken, an apology perhaps, or a plea. The woman raised the phone to her ear. James watched her, the cool detachment of an observer mixing with the quiet burn of a man too used to being pushed into corners he didn't deserve. He could already hear the sharp tone she would use, the carefully chosen words designed to paint him as a threat, to strip him of his humanity before the story even reached another ear. That was the danger of people like her. They knew the power of narrative, the poison of perception. For a long moment, the night was filled with nothing but the sound of her voice murmuring into the receiver. James could not catch every word, but he didn't need to. He knew the rhythm, the cadence of someone spinning fear into a weapon. He heard fragments, suspicious, aggressive, following my son. Each word another stone thrown at a man already carrying too many scars. And yet, as he stood there beneath the amber glow of the street lamp, James felt something strange. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, measured calm, the kind that came before storms he had faced countless times. He straightened his posture, his eyes steady, though he allowed no trace of authority to slip into his tone when he finally spoke. "You'll regret that call," he said quietly, not as a threat, but as a simple truth. Her eyes flashed, sharp with the satisfaction of someone who believed she had already won. "We'll see about that." The line between them was drawn, invisible but unyielding. Minutes stretched longer than they should have. James could feel the neighborhood shifting, awakening, as word of the disturbance traveled faster than the wind. Lights clicked on, doors cracked open. Whispers carried across driveways. It was no longer just James and the woman. It was a stage, an audience gathering in the shadows, waiting to see who would stumble and who would stand tall. And then, in the quiet before the storm, came a sound that tightened every muscle in James's body, the distant wail of sirens. They cut through the night like knives, sharp and undeniable, growing louder with each second. The woman's smirk deepened, her chin lifting as if victory were already in her grasp. She turned back toward her house, satisfied. "Good," she muttered half to herself. "Let them deal with you." But James didn't flinch. Instead, he let his gaze drift across the rows of houses to the watching eyes hidden behind curtains. He wondered how many of them would step forward, how many would remain silent, and how many secretly agreed with the woman's venom. Silence, he knew, could be as dangerous as hatred, sometimes more. The patrol car's headlights appeared at the far end of the street, slicing through the darkness, reflecting off windows. The sound grew, deafening, oppressive, pressing down on every heart that beat within earshot. James stood motionless, the cart of groceries at his side, every bag an anchor to reality, to the ordinariness that had been shattered in a single evening. As the cruiser rolled to a stop, James caught the faintest flicker of movement across the street. A neighbor, Mr. Harris, a man James had spoken to only twice, was slipping back into his house, phone pressed to his ear. Not calling the police, James realized, but someone else. A warning, perhaps, or something darker. The thought lingered like smoke. The officer who stepped out was young, face flushed with the thrill of being called to a disturbance. His hand hovered near his belt as he scanned the scene, eyes darting between James and the woman standing on her porch. He didn't ask questions. Instead, he turned instinctively toward her. "Ma'am, you made the call?" "Yes, officer," she said quickly, her voice dripping with relief. "That man has been harassing my son. He followed him, cornered him, and now he's refusing to leave. I don't feel safe in my own neighborhood." James exhaled slowly, the weight of the lie settling heavy in the air. There it was, the betrayal, painted as truth, sharpened with fear. And for the briefest moment, James felt the edge of something colder, the realization that this was not simply about one woman's cruelty. There were others watching, waiting, ready to use silence or lies to push him into a corner. What none of them yet knew was that the man they were trying to corner was not prey. He was the storm itself, held in check only by patience and choice. The young officer adjusted a stance, his hand never straying far from his belt, as though the simple act of standing near James required preparation for conflict. His eyes darted nervously, first toward the woman, then back at James, unsure of how to place the pieces together. James could almost hear the gears grinding in the man's head, a puzzle half formed but already colored by the woman's words. James took in the officer's appearance with a measured glance. He couldn't have been more than 26, maybe 27. The stiff newness of his uniform told James he hadn't been on the force long. His posture screamed eagerness, too ready to prove himself, too eager to make the right call, or at least what he thought would be seen as the right call. James had seen dozens like him before, men thrown into storms without knowing how to read the winds. The woman, her name, James recalled suddenly, was Margaret, though most neighbors knew her simply as Maggie from the HOA, crossed her arms and took a half-step closer to the officer. She was performing now, weaving her narrative for her audience. Her voice shook with just the right amount of practiced fear, her words dripping with a rehearsed rhythm. "He was standing too close to my boy. My son told me he felt cornered. This man wouldn't back away. And when I told him to leave, he threatened me." Her tone cracked in a way that suggested vulnerability, though her eyes sparkled with the satisfaction of control. James remained still, his card at his side, his face composed. "That's not what happened," he said quietly. His voice carried no tremor, no need to shout above her. It was calm, deliberate, but it pressed against the performance she was building. The officer hesitated, caught between two conflicting pictures. On one side, a woman clutching the role of victim with practiced ease. On the other, a man who stood too tall, too steady to fit into the mold of an aggressor. And yet, the uniformed trained man liked the young officer to respond to fear above calm. "Sir," the officer said finally, his voice uncertain, "I'm going to need you to explain yourself." James's lips curved slightly, a near smile, though it held no warmth. He could feel the pull of his other self, the commander who demanded presence and authority. But here, in this moment, he was still James Carter, neighbor man with groceries. He took a slow breath. "I was walking home. Your dispatcher will have the record of the call, but what you'll hear won't match the truth. I didn't touch her son. I didn't threaten her. I bought groceries. That's all." Margaret's laugh rang out, sharp and cutting. "Oh, please, do you think anyone here is going to believe that?" She gestured to the houses around them, to the shadows at windows and the silhouettes peering through blinds. "Everyone saw. Everyone knows what kind of man you are." The accusation hung in the air, heavier than the night itself. James looked toward the houses. Faces pulled back from glass, curtains closed tighter. Silence, thick and complicated. No one stepped out to speak for him. No one whispered the truth. They melted into the background, safe behind their walls, leaving him alone under the unforgiving glow of the street lamp. But not entirely alone. From the porch, Ethan lingered just inside the doorway, his small figure framed by the light, His wide eyes locked on James with something that looked almost like regret. The boy's lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but Margaret's hand pressed against his shoulder held him in place, silencing him without words. James felt the pang of it deep inside. The boy's silence was not his fault, yet it became another stone in the growing wall around him. "Sir," the officer said again, his voice carrying a little more force now, "I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the cart." James glanced at the groceries. Bread, milk, a jar of honey Olivia liked when she was home. Ordinary things turned into evidence in someone else's story. He stepped back, lifting his hands slowly, though the gesture was more out of discipline than submission. He had been in this position before, different uniforms, different accusations, but the script always seemed to find its way back to him. "See," Margaret said quickly, her voice rising with triumph. "He knows he's guilty." But James didn't answer her. His eyes flicked briefly to the officer, then back to the house across the street, Mr. Harris's house. The curtains had stilled, the lights dimmed, yet James couldn't shake the image of the man clutching his phone earlier, whispering into the dark. Was he warning someone? Or was he part of something larger? The thought lingered unsettling. A betrayal not yet revealed, but waiting, coiled like a snake in the grass. The officer reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I'm on scene." "Wait." James's voice cut through the night, steady, commanding in a way that startled even the officer. It wasn't just the tone of a man defending himself. It carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. For a second, the officer froze, the radio still in his hand, his eyes widening at the authority in James's voice. Margaret's smile faltered, her certainty cracked for just a moment, her gaze narrowing as if she were seeing James anew. Not just a man with groceries, something more. James stepped forward slowly, careful not to move too quickly, careful to let the night absorb his words. "You don't want to make this mistake," he said softly, "because once you set this in motion, you can't take it back." It wasn't a plea. It was a truth delivered with the weight of a man who had seen too many lives ruined by careless decisions. The officer swallowed hard, his radio lowering slightly. He looked at Margaret, then back at James. Confusion clouded his face. The script he had expected to follow was breaking apart. "Who are you?" the officer asked, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain. For a moment, James considered telling him the truth then and there, stripping away the mask and showing him the badge that outranked every fear in this neighborhood. But timing was everything. Some truths, revealed too early, lost their power. And James knew this story was only beginning. "I'm a man who came home with groceries," he said instead. His eyes, though, told a different story, one the officer could feel, but not yet name. Margaret bristled, sensing the shift. "Don't listen to him. He's manipulating you. That's what men like him do. They twist things. They make you question yourself." Her words spilled out quickly, too quickly, betraying the edge of desperation creeping into her performance. The officer hesitated, his jaw clenched, his hand tightening around the radio. His training urged him one way, his instincts tugged another. And somewhere in that fragile balance, James saw it, the seed of doubt taking root. Across the street, another curtain twitched, another silent witness, another secret waiting in the shadows. James knew then that the real conflict was not with Margaret alone. It was with an entire neighborhood that thrived on silence, that fed on fear, that would sooner betray the truth than break their fragile illusion of order. And somewhere within that silence, someone would choose betrayal. He could feel it pressing closer, like thunder rolling on the horizon. The announcement had barely faded when the cabin's usual chatter fell into uneasy murmurs. Melissa stood frozen in the aisle, her tray still trembling in her hands. Her eyes darted over the rows of faces, some whispering in curiosity, others narrowing with suspicion. She knew she had crossed a line with her tone toward Jordan, but what unsettled her most was how quickly her words had been weaponized against her. A simple confrontation now echoed like a thunderclap across the cabin. Jordan sat in his seat, hands resting calmly on the armrest, his expression unreadable. But behind the stillness was a quiet fire, something that unsettled Melissa. He had not retaliated with anger, not even with loud protests. Yet his silence carried a weight far more dangerous than any outburst. It felt calculated, deliberate, and though she did not yet know it, that silence was the beginning of the storm. As the aircraft pressed against the wind and clouds smeared across the windows, Melissa's supervisor, Denise, approached with her lips pursed tight. Denise's steps were sharp, deliberate, as if each one struck an invisible drumbeat of authority. She leaned close, her whisper slicing through the hum of the cabin. "Melissa," she said, "you need to tread carefully. The captain has already been alerted. We can't have escalations on this flight." Melissa swallowed hard, forcing herself to nod. "I understand," she murmured, though her chest burned with embarrassment. What she did not see was Jordan, quietly pulling a sleek black phone from his pocket, sliding his thumb across the glass with casual ease. He turned slightly, enough to shield his actions from the nearest passengers, and pressed one name on the screen. The line connected instantly. A voice on the other end answered with a blend of respect and concern. "Sir?" Jordan's lips curved ever so slightly. "Yes, I'm on board. I need you to make the call. Immediately." The person on the other side did not hesitate. "Understood." Jordan ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket with practiced calm. No one around him seemed to notice, but something had shifted. His silence, his composure, it was no longer a sign of restraint. It was controlled. Minutes later, just as Melissa tried to regain her composure by serving water to the row behind Jordan, the intercom cracked alive. The captain's voice, usually warm and steady, now carried a tremor of unease. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been instructed to delay our flight path and await clearance. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." A ripple of confusion swept through the cabin. Whispers rose. "What's happening? Why are we waiting?" Passengers glanced nervously at one another. Melissa froze, her hand clutching a half-filled cup, her throat dry. This was unusual, very unusual. Jordan's eyes flickered toward the ceiling speakers, then back to Melissa, who stood just 2 rows ahead. Their gazes locked for a fleeting moment, and she felt something she could not name, an invisible thread, taut and suffocating. She looked away quickly, but her pulse betrayed her. The betrayal revealed itself not in words, but in the quiet unraveling of trust. One of the senior attendants, a man named Richard, approached Melissa with an uncharacteristically cold glare. "What exactly did you say to that passenger earlier?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. Melissa blinked. "I just asked him to keep his voice down. He was disruptive." "Funny," Richard said, his eyes narrowing. "Because the way he described it, you were shouting, threatening, out of line." Melissa's mouth fell open. "What? That's not, he's twisting it." But Richard's expression did not soften. He had worked alongside her for years, had shared jokes in galleys and rolled eyes during long shifts, but now he looked at her as if she were a stranger. Melissa felt the ground tilt beneath her. Someone she thought she could rely on, someone she trusted, was already leaning toward the other side. Jordan, calm as ever, sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. Yet behind his stillness, he was pulling strings she could not see. The call he made was more than a complaint. It was leverage, and while Melissa scrambled to defend herself in front of her peers, he had already shifted the narrative. The whispers among the crew thickened like smoke. "She crossed a line. She disrespected him. She could cost us." Melissa heard fragments, saw the way eyes darted toward her, and for the first time in her career, that passenger you shouted at, he's not just some passenger. He's connected. High level. They're telling us to treat this with extreme caution. Do you understand what that means? Melissa's stomach dropped. She felt cold spread through her veins. What? How? How is that even possible? But Denise shook her head. I don't know. But someone upstairs already knows about this. That means phones are ringing before we even land. And if that's the case, Melissa, your job isn't the only thing at risk here. This could be bigger. Melissa's world tilted again. What had started as a heated exchange in a crowded cabin was no longer about professional conduct. This was something else, something calculated, orchestrated. Jordan finally spoke, his voice steady, calm, and edged with quiet authority. Sometimes, he said, loud enough for both crew and passengers nearby to hear, it's not about how loud someone speaks. It's about who they're speaking to. The words sank into Melissa like ice water. She realized with dawning horror that this wasn't just a passenger dispute. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous, something that reached beyond her small world of serving trays and safety demonstrations. And in that moment, though she could not yet see the full shape of the storm, Melissa understood one thing with absolute clarity. She had just stepped into a battle she was never prepared to fight. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, as though every breath carried an unspoken warning. Conversations had dulled to murmurs, passengers stealing glances at Olivia but avoiding her gaze, the way people do when they fear being dragged into someone else's storm. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered faintly, giving the illusion of a stage set where every actor had forgotten their lines. Olivia sat motionless, shoulders squared, hands folded neatly in her lap, but the stiffness in her posture betrayed the turmoil clawing at her ribs. She looked calm only because calmness was the mask she had perfected over years of quiet battles. She could hear the flight attendant, Claire, whispering with a colleague in the galley. Their voices were hushed, yet the tones carried sharp edges that cut through the low hum of the engines. "She's trouble," Claire muttered, her consonants hard. "Mark my words, people like that never sit quietly for long." The words landed on Olivia's ears like shards of glass. People like that. She had grown used to coded language, the polite cruelty wrapped in careful phrases. But when it came at a moment like this, it wasn't simply insulting, it was dangerous. It told her this wasn't over. Her mind spun back to the look Claire had given her minutes earlier, a look not of duty, but of disdain. Olivia had faced worse, of course. Boardroom whispers, journalists eager to paint her as lucky rather than capable, colleagues who doubted her authority until she proved them wrong. But here, inside this narrow tube of recycled air thousands of feet above the ground, she couldn't rely on the shields she usually wore. Here, the rules bent in favor of the uniform, the badge, and the authority of the attendant's word over the passenger's truth. And yet Olivia refused to shrink. She straightened her spine. Though her pulse quickened, she replayed her father's words long ago after her first encounter with open humiliation. Dignity is not give and live. You carry it. You protect it even when they try to strip it from you. He had been right then and he was right now. Across the aisle, a boy no older than 16 shifted uncomfortably, watching her with wide, worried eyes. His mother, seated beside him, tugged his sleeve and whispered, "Don't stare." But Olivia caught the boy's gaze before he looked away, and in that fleeting connection, she saw something raw. Fear, yes, but also recognition. He understood, even at his age, what it meant to be seen as a problem before you spoke a word. The plane jolted slightly with turbulence, a shiver through the fuselage, and the sudden motion pulled a nervous laugh from some passengers. But Olivia felt no such release. Instead, she noticed Claire returning to the aisle, her smile stretched thin, her body stiff with false pleasantness. "Ladies and gentlemen," Claire announced, her voice smooth but carrying the weight of authority, "we ask for your cooperation in maintaining calm during this flight. Any disruption, no matter how small, will be addressed immediately." Her eyes, though, landed squarely on Olivia as she delivered the line. A warning disguised as a routine announcement. A challenge laid bare for everyone to witness. Inside, Olivia's mind churned. She knew the danger wasn't in what had happened already, but in what could come next. Claire's hostility was no longer hidden. It was staged for the passengers to see, planting seeds of suspicion. All it would take was one false claim, one accusation that Olivia had raised her voice, refused an order, or caused a disturbance, and the full weight of airline protocol would fall against her. She would be labeled a threat. She would be removed, humiliated further, her word swallowed by Claire's authority. And then the betrayal began to surface, not in full, but as a shadow. Olivia overheard Claire's colleague say softly, "Are you sure you want to go through with this? She hasn't done anything wrong." The hesitation was faint, but it was there. Claire's reply, however, was firm and cold. "Trust me. Management will back me up. They always do." That sentence struck like lightning. Olivia wasn't dealing with a simple clash of personalities. This was deliberate, calculated. Claire wasn't just acting out of bias. She was maneuvering, setting Olivia up for something larger. Her heart hammered as she pieced it together. This wasn't merely about her presence on the plane. Claire was pushing, prodding, waiting for Olivia to react so she could use it against her. And the passengers, silent witnesses bound by the strange etiquette of air travel, would likely side with the attendant, not the woman alone in her seat. A dilemma rooted itself deep inside Olivia's chest. She could confront Claire directly, call out the manipulation, and demand respect that would satisfy the fire building inside her, the fire that told her silence was complicity. But to do so would risk exactly what Claire wanted, to paint her as the problem. Alternatively, she could remain silent, endure the indignities, and wait until she had the power of her voice again on the ground. Yet silence came with its own cost, the erosion of dignity, the quiet acceptance of abuse. The turbulence subsided, but inside Olivia the storm only grew. She stared at her folded hands, weighing the choices that had no easy resolution. She thought of her responsibilities, the board meetings waiting, the investors she would soon face, the employees who looked to her for leadership. If she allowed herself to be diminished here, even in private, would that fracture something essential in her spirit? And then came another complication. A man seated a few rows back stood suddenly, gesturing toward Claire. "Excuse me, miss," he said, "but I think you're being unfair to that woman." His voice carried, and several passengers turned to look. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Someone had spoken on her behalf. A stranger had shattered the wall of silence. Claire froze, her professional smile faltering. "Sir, please remain seated," she said quickly, her tone clipped. But the man persisted. "I saw how you spoke to her. We all did. Don't pretend it was routine." Olivia felt a flicker of gratitude, but also fear. This was precisely the spark Claire had been waiting for, a confrontation she could twist. Claire's lips tightened as she turned toward Olivia. "Ma'am," she said loudly enough for the cabin to hear, "if you're encouraging other passengers to interfere with crew duties, I'll have no choice but to report you." The words dropped like stones into the silence. Olivia hadn't spoken a word, yet already she was accused of orchestrating rebellion. Her pulse roared in her ears. Every option now carried weighty consequences, each choice threatening to tip the balance further toward disaster. She looked again at the boy across the aisle. He hadn't looked away this time. His wide eyes seemed to plead with her. "Don't give them what they want. Don't let them break you." Olivia inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She could not control Claire's malice, but she could control her own response. The choice wasn't between silence and surrender, it was between fear and strength, between being cast as a villain and standing firm as herself. The cabin held its breath, waiting for a move. The cabin air felt heavier than ever, thick with a silence that was no longer ordinary, but loaded, waiting to split open. The plane, suspended in the sky like a trapped bird, had turned into an arena. Every glance, every shuffle, every muted cough seemed to anticipate the eruption that had been simmering since the moment the flight attendant's voice first cut through the calm. Emma, her authority trembling under the weight of her own actions, stood rigid at the aisle, her eyes darting. He sat with his shoulders squared, his presence commanding without effort, though his chest rose and fell with the rhythm of a storm contained just beneath his ribs. His gaze fixed on Emma, steady, unflinching, held the weight of every humiliation, every injustice endured, not only on this flight, but in countless other unseen moments. And yet, there was restraint there, a discipline honed by years of walking through fire without allowing the flames to consume him. The passengers were no longer passive watchers. Whispers threaded through the rows like sparks on dry wood, and phones angled discreetly to capture what had now become a spectacle too charged to ignore. Some looked at Marcus with sympathy, others with hesitation, but all knew instinctively they were on the cusp of witnessing something that would not be forgotten. The captain's voice had fallen silent after the cryptic announcement, "We will remain grounded until this situation is resolved." That statement, stripped of detail, carried the weight of finality. The truth was a stone lodged in everyone's throat. No one yet knew its shape, but they could feel its edges pressing. Emma stepped forward, clutching the hem of her uniform skirt as though grounding herself. Her voice, usually sharp, came out uneven, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "Marcus," she said, quieter this time, "please, let's not make this worse than it already is." But her words betrayed her. They weren't about him, they were about her unraveling. She was begging not for peace, but for the preservation of the mask she'd worn for years, the uniform stitched not only of fabric, but of entitlement. Marcus's lips parted, his voice resonant yet tempered. "You think I made this worse?" He leaned forward slightly, his words carrying beyond Emma to every corner of the cabin. "I sat here. I asked for nothing more than the dignity owed to any passenger. But you," he let the sentence hang, not with anger but with gravity, as if allowing Emma the chance to finish it herself. Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to claw back control, but her tongue was suddenly foreign in her own mouth. And then the truth broke through the cabin like thunder. The door near the cockpit opened, and a tall man in a dark suit emerged. His expression was stone, but his eyes locked on Marcus with familiarity, almost reverence. He carried the weight of authority not in his badge, but in the silence that followed him, as though the plane itself adjusted to his presence. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice rang out, measured yet undeniable, "I am Daniel Clark, chairman of the airline." The ripple that moved through the passengers was immediate, gasps, murmurs, sudden understanding. Every phone tilted higher, recording with renewed urgency. Emma's face drained of color as her knees seemed to weaken beneath her. Daniel did not look at her first. He crossed the aisle with purpose, his gaze steady on Marcus. When he reached him, he extended a hand, not as a gesture of pity but of acknowledgement. "Marcus," he said firmly, "you should not have had to endure this. Not here. Not anywhere." Emma's breath hitched. The betrayal was not merely professional, it was personal. She had worked for years under the illusion that her authority was untouchable, her judgments unquestioned. But now the ground she had built her identity on crumbled. Daniel knew Marcus. More than that, he respected him. Whispers grew louder. "Who is Marcus? What does this mean? Why does the chairman know him?" Emma's chest tightened as the realization cut deep. The betrayal wasn't Marcus's presence, it was the truth that had been hidden all along. Marcus wasn't just another passenger. He had ties that dwarfed her authority, and she, in her arrogance, had laid her own downfall bare before an entire cabin of witnesses. The confrontation swelled to its peak. Emma stepped back, her voice trembling. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know who he was." Marcus rose slowly from his seat, the motion deliberate as though reclaiming the air itself. He looked down at Emma, not with triumph, but with the weight of disappointment that struck harder than anger. "That's the problem," he said, his tone cutting with truth. "You only measure respect by who someone is, not by what they deserve as human beings." The silence afterward was suffocating. Every passenger felt the truth lodge within them. It wasn't only Emma who was being indicted. It was a reflection of every quiet injustice they had ever ignored, every time dignity had been conditional rather than inherent. Emma staggered back against the galley wall, her composure fractured beyond repair. Her betrayal wasn't just of Marcus, nor even of her uniform, but of the very humanity she had failed to recognize. The climax hung in the air, electric, before Daniel's voice broke it. This flight will not leave the ground until accountability is made clear. And in that instant, the confrontation crystallized into more than a personal reckoning. It became a trial, not in court, but in the court of human conscience, carried out 30,000 feet above the ground. The truths had been revealed, the masks torn away. But resolution, what came after, still hung in the balance. The silence after the confrontation was heavier than the shouting that had filled the cabin minutes earlier. Passengers sat stiff in their seats, their faces pale, their hands gripping armrests as if the air itself had turned into storm. At the center of it all, Angela remained seated, her face hidden behind her trembling hands. The flight attendant who had humiliated her, Melissa, stood near the galley, her uniform suddenly feeling too tight, her own breathing too shallow. The weight of truth pressed down on every person aboard, but it bore most heavily on Melissa, who had now realized who Angela truly was, someone she could never afford to belittle. Angela didn't speak at first. She let the cabin breathe again, the tension easing into whispers. When she finally raised her head, her eyes were glistening not just with the sting of insult, but with the fire of dignity reclaimed. She turned not to Melissa, but to the passengers who had witnessed it all. "You've all seen what happened," she said, her voice steady though it carried a tremor underneath. Humiliation in front of strangers, a reminder that no matter who we are, there are always people willing to strip us of our worth if we let them. But I will not carry shame today. The shame doesn't belong to me. Her words cut through the air sharper than any reprimand could. People shifted in their seats, ashamed of their silence, of their complicity. Melissa lowered her eyes, unable to meet Angela's gaze. The captain's voice broke through the intercom then, steady and cautious. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances, this flight will be grounded shortly. Please remain calm and seated until further instructions." The landing itself was uneventful, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Everyone seemed afraid to move, afraid to speak. When the plane finally touched down, officials boarded, their presence making Melissa's throat close tighter. Angela, however, rose with quiet authority, her every step deliberate. At that moment, she wasn't just a passenger. She wasn't just a black woman humiliated before a cabin of strangers. She was something larger, proof that truth eventually claws its way to the surface, no matter how hard prejudice tries to bury it. The betrayal had been laid bare. Melissa's attempt to assert power over her was not an isolated act of cruelty, but part of a larger sickness, one Angela had faced countless times in countless ways. But today, it had unfolded before witnesses who could no longer pretend such things did not happen. The betrayal wasn't just Melissa's, it was everyone's. Every quiet passenger who looked away, every whispered remark, every judgment cast before knowing the truth. When officials escorted Angela off the plane, it was with respect. Cameras outside flashed, voices called out, and for the first time, Melissa realized how deep her mistake had sunk. This wasn't going to be forgotten. It was bigger than her, bigger than a single flight. It was a moment that would ripple outward, dragging uncomfortable truths into the light. Angela, however, didn't smile. She didn't look triumphant. Instead, she looked weary. Because victories like these never came without scars. Later, sitting in the quiet of an airport lounge, away from cameras and murmuring voices, Angela allowed herself to reflect. She had spent her whole life fighting to be seen fully. For her work, her leadership, her humanity. Yet today had reminded her again how quickly prejudice could strip all of that away. One shout, one order, one insult was all it took for people to forget everything else. She closed her eyes, letting her mind replay the moment Melissa had raised her voice. The sting of those words meant to diminish her. They still hurt, but she also knew stories had power. And now, this story wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had been on that plane, everyone who would hear about it afterward. Melissa, meanwhile, sat alone in a corner of the airport, her career dangling by a thread. She had built her life on control, on rules, on asserting her authority where she could. But now she saw the truth. Authority without compassion was nothing but cruelty dressed in uniform. The betrayal she had carried out wasn't just against Angela. It was against herself, against the ideals she had once thought her job stood for. Safety, dignity, service. She had betrayed those values for the cheap illusion of control, and now the cost of that choice stared her in the face. Angela's reflection continued long after the cameras left. She thought of the passengers, the silence they had kept, the way some had looked at her, their eyes filled with quiet judgment. Until her identity shattered their assumptions, it pained her most of all, because dignity should not depend on recognition, on status, or on wealth. She whispered to herself, "They should have respected me, even if I were no one." The truth was clear. Respect, given only to the powerful, is not respect at all. It is fear. And she knew, deep in her heart, that her fight wasn't over. It never would be. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, she felt both heavier and lighter. Heavier with the weight of wounds reopened, lighter with the knowledge that her silence had not been the final word. She had spoken. She had refused to carry shame that wasn't hers. Walking out of the airport, Angela lifted her face to the sky, the evening sun breaking through scattered clouds. A simple thought carried her forward. That dignity reclaimed in the face of cruelty is more powerful than cruelty itself. Melissa watched from afar, unseen, her chest aching with something she couldn't quite name. Regret, shame, maybe even a yearning for redemption. For the first time in years, she questioned who she had become. The story ended not with triumph, nor with defeat, but with truth exposed. And that was enough. For every witness, for every passenger, for every silent bystander, the memory of what they had seen would linger. Some would try to forget. Others would carry it like a stone in their chest. But none could erase it. Angela had been humiliated, yes, but in refusing to bow, she had turned humiliation into revelation. And in that revelation lay the seed of something more, a reminder that respect must be unconditional, that dignity belongs to every soul, and that silence in the face of injustice is a betrayal all its own. That was the moral she carried and the one she left behind. If you found this story powerful, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Your support helps us bring more important stories to light.